You're listening to Acts in 10, a podcast series from the Gathering Community Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm your host, Tabby Horn, and we're going to dive deeper into the book of Acts. So grab your tea, or if you must, your coffee, and let's get started. Welcome to Acts in 10. Today we're looking at Acts chapter 6. Acts chapter 6 is really interesting because what we've seen so far in Acts is that the believers are rapidly multiplying, that the apostles are teaching, they're doing miracles. We're seeing this like rapid expansion of the gospel. We're seeing opposition. We're seeing some people get put in prison for talking about Jesus. And Acts 6, the first part at least, kind of just like pauses that. And it makes the point that as growth happens, it doesn't eliminate all problems, it just creates new problems. The believers in Acts 6, they learn that growth creates new challenges. And as a lead pastor of a 3-year-old church plant, I really appreciate this chapter because it's really practical. It reminds us that, yes, we have to attend to the spiritual things, but we also have to be practical. And so we ensure that the way that we're doing things doesn't hinder the mission, but moves it forward. So let's look at Acts chapter 6, verse 1. It says this, "But as the believers rapidly multiplied, there were rumblings of discontent. The Greek-speaking believers complained about the Hebrew-speaking believers, saying that their widows were being discriminated against in the daily distribution of food." So what's happening here is that the believers have decided, like we have talked about in other parts of Acts, they have decided to sell their property, to sell their possessions, to give all of their money to the apostles to be used for the poor and for the building of the church and the expansion of the ministry. And so they have given so much that there's no needy among them, that they're able to feed people, which is really awesome. It's really cool to see, right? Like, so they're feeding people every day. But what happens is, even in the middle of that awesome moment, there are issues. There are things to figure out. There is organization that needs to happen. And so the Greek speaking believers are upset because they feel like their widows are not getting enough food, or maybe not getting the best choice of food, and they're being kind of pushed aside while the Hebrew speaking believers get all of the food they want. Okay. And so they bring this up to the apostles. And the apostles think about it and they're like, yeah, this is a problem. And at the same time, we are called to preach. We are called to spread the gospel. We are called to pray. So, what is it? How can we fix this issue? And so, what they decide to do is they select 7 leaders. They select 7 men who are full of the Holy Spirit and full of wisdom. And those 7 people oversee this daily distribution of food. They make sure that everyone is getting equal access to what they need. And I love this story because, just from a pastoral and leadership perspective, I think there's some important lessons to be learned. Well, one of the lessons is this: that healthy churches solve problems without losing their mission. So there are going to be problems. And I know this is a little bit more like church oriented versus just everybody oriented, but like, as a believer, you're hopefully part of a church. And so there are going to be issues as churches grow, as the gospel expands. There is a conflict in this chapter that emerges between the Hebrew and Greek speaking widows. And the apostles, I want you to pay close attention. They don't ignore it, and they don't become defensive. So if you're in a church and you bring up a concern and your pastor ignores it or becomes defensive, that's something to pay attention to, because that's not the model that's demonstrated here in Acts. Like, we actually see it. They address the issue. And what's interesting is that, like, this first problem, this first big problem about the church, like, this is the first church, the first Christian church, and their first problem, right? It's not a theological discrepancy, it's an organizational challenge. The church is actually growing faster than its systems are growing. And there's a lot I could say about this, but just to keep it brief, I will ask this simple question: are you willing to adapt so that the mission can continue? See, growth and expansion, they are wonderful, they are God ordained, and they create issues within the church. And so, what we see here in Acts is that the model that is set for us, for modern day people that are in a church, or modern day leaders or pastors, the example that's set is to raise up more leaders, to empower people, and to keep doing what God has called the church to do. And sometimes we don't want to adapt when there's an issue. We want to actually just things to keep going as they are. Like it's easiest to ignore stuff. Like we just want it to keep going like it is. Or there's, this danger that I think can happen to those of us who have been in church for a long time, especially. But really for any of us, I think there's this danger of clinging to the past, clinging to the good old days, clinging to the feeling or whatever that you first had. Like, well, I want the church that I first started attending. I don't want this. I don't want a church that expands. I don't want to have to do 2 services. I don't want to have to change this. I don't want to have to step up in this way. I just want this person to run everything and I just want it to stay the same. And that's a natural feeling. But what we see in Acts is that that is not the solution to helping the church stay healthy and adapt so that the mission of God can move forward. And so, for those of us who are part of a church, which again, I hope you are we willing to adapt so that the mission can continue? And so, for some of us, this means we're willing to let go of some of our preferences. For some of us, this means we're willing to step up and to step in instead of just watching. This is what happened. Like the apostles, they couldn't do it on their own. They were like, well, we've been called to testify and to share the good news, and we can't do that and this, but we recognize both are important. So what do? They find leaders that, catch this, are full of the Holy Spirit and have wisdom. The church needs more men and women filled with the Holy Spirit and have wisdom. And so that's just like, as a pastor, that's like a prayer of mine, that you would be full of the Holy Spirit, that you would have wisdom, and that you would be willing to take a step forward, to adapt so the mission can continue, to let some of your preferences go so that more people can find and follow Jesus and experience the power of the Holy Spirit in their everyday lives. And in the second part of chapter 6, what we see is that ordinary people step up. And it introduces a guy named Stephen and a guy named Philip. Neither of these guys are one of the 12 apostles. They are just like average, normal people. And yet, in chapter 6 and even in chapter 7 and chapter 8, they both become major figures in the story of gospel expansion. They both have significant parts to play. And so this chapter, it kind of reminds us that the church advances when normal people, everyday believers, embrace responsibility. When normal people will decide to own something. Expansion, great ministry, it happens when normal people step up. And without it, the church is all over the place. Because again, we want to be spiritually minded and we want to hear what the Spirit is saying, but also sometimes the Spirit is saying very practical things like raise up some new leaders to help oversee this. And so as we move forward in a church and as we move forward in a believing community, we have to continue to ask ourselves, how do we need to adapt to move the gospel forward, to move the mission forward, to ensure that everyone has equal access, to ensure that people are getting what they need, to ensure that we're pleasing the Holy Spirit. And so maybe today God has been inviting you to move from attending church to contributing to church. Maybe today God is reminding you that it's time for you to be full of the power and the overflow of the Holy Spirit. See, the church is the strongest when every single believer sees themselves as part of the mission. My goal at the gathering is not that everyone would see me as the one that's driving the mission forward, but that everyone would see themselves as someone who is there to move forward the mission, because the mission matters most. The mission is that people would find and follow Jesus and experience the power of the Holy Spirit. That's just how we say our mission statement, but the real mission is that we would be witnesses telling people everywhere about Jesus in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So great ministry happens when ordinary people step up, and healthy churches solve problems without losing their mission. I want to encourage you, if there's an organizational issue in your church, don't step back from it. Don't just say, well, let me go find another church, because here's a newsflash. There's organizational problems in every organization. Here's my challenge to you. Be part of the solution. Step up decide it's time for you to lead. Ask the Holy Spirit to fill you with His Spirit, to fill you with wisdom. Because spiritual leadership, it doesn't just require skills, it requires wisdom that only the Holy Spirit can give. And so I want to encourage you today to ask the Holy Spirit, am I open to adapting so that your mission can continue in my church, in my neighborhood, in my city? Am I willing to step up? Just being an ordinary person, like, am I willing to move from attending to contributing, from sometimes engaging to connecting, from connecting and having all my needs met to owning and helping others meet their needs? The church is strongest when every believer sees themselves as part of the mission. And that's the story of Acts chapter 6. You've been listening to Acts in 10, a podcast series from the Gathering Community Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Join us in person on a Sunday morning at 10:30 or check us out online at thegatheringmn.com. We'll see you next time.